Here it means that the boys are visibly healthier, sharper, more focused than the other men in the king's training. So that's why I think that something was up with the food. So now I'm going to skip to another source, more so talking about the possibility of the food being offered to idols, that particular explanation or stance. So now we're going to look at endtimeinsights.org. It said food offered to idols. This was actually published in 2018. It says, upon his arrival in the imperial city, Daniel was confronted with a type of predicament. If he consumed the food and drink of the pagan king, it would violate his ritual, if you will, purity. While he might have wished to avoid eating unclean meats, more likely his concern was that consuming the royal delicacy, so they are also saying rich foods are royal delicacies, okay, would mean his participation in the idolatrous rituals that the Babylonians indulged in, especially the royal Babylonian court and their beliefs in many gods. Either way, the young man's decision could have dire consequences. It says this was the kind of dilemma every believer faces sooner or later, whether to compromise with the demands and expectations of the world order or remain faithful to God. It says in the passage, Daniel objected to the meats and the wine from the royal table. However, according to the book of Leviticus, wine by itself did not cause ritual defilement. No. So then it says, moreover, Daniel made no reference to the dietary regulations of the Torah and the Hebrew term rendered defiled. Here is not the same one used for unclean as in Leviticus. And then they made reference to Daniel 1:8 and verse 12. Then they go into the actual Hebrew translations into English. It says Babylonian religious customs point to a different conflict, participation in idolatrous practices. Daniel objected to consuming provisions from the table of the king, and the stress is on the source of the food, the royal table. It says the young exile proposed a test. For 10 days, he and his friends would only eat vegetables and drink water. Afterward, their Babylonian keeper could compare their appearance with that of the other young men who consumed the food from the royal table. It says idols played a very key role in Babylonian religious rituals. It was believed the god was present in his or her image kept in its temple. Such images were provided with daily meals of food and drinks. Let me read that again. Such images were provided with the daily meals of food and drink. The king provided the required foodstuffs for the god's meal, and no one else was present could eat before the deity had finished consuming it. Thereafter, the remaining food was distributed for consumption at the royal table. Thus, the king's provisions were linked to idolatry of the Babylonian temples. Now, in this particular source, they also make reference to the book of Revelation. It says there is a story in it that's a letter to the assembly of Smyrna. The congregation was told to expect persecution. You will be tried and you will have tribulation 10 days. Then they said the Greek verb rendered tried in a particular version of the story in Daniel is the same one used in the Greek text of the letter to Smyrna. He says in chapter 20, we read that those who take part in the first resurrection will avoid the second death. At the great white throne of judgment, death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire, and the latter is identified as the second death. Thus, the term does not refer to the death that all men experience sooner or later. The faithful believer may die a violent death for his testimony, but he will not undergo the second death. And then they make reference to Revelations 20, verse 6, as well as Revelations 20:14. Alright, so I found a third interpretation found in verse by verse commentary. It says, well, wait a minute. It's more so centered on Daniel 1:8, just that particular scripture. It was done in 2002, and it says, but Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Then they give the original scripture. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar gave the young captives from Judea food and wine from his own table. They had the very best. They made sure that they highlighted best, okay, that the king could offer. However, these provisions did not meet the precepts of the Mosaic law. So Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not eat this food. The word proposed carries the ideal of decided resolution. Daniel's character was already formed, okay, for following God before the test, they keep saying it was a test, came to him. The phrase proposed in his heart could be translated as laid upon his heart. Daniel put himself under the full commitment to follow his heart, okay? So then it says the principle. The principle of all of this is an all-consuming purpose of living for the glory of God that will enable us to meet the spiritual tests of life. Then it goes on to say, let's go down, the application. The will of God was the all-consuming purpose of Daniel's life. Whether Daniel would eat the king's food was the supreme test of his fidelity to the Lord and his word. All of the inducements or promises could not deter Daniel from his purpose. A life of luxury landed in his lap, yet he refused it forthwith. He would be faithful to God no matter the cost, and he set aside the luxury of Nebuchadnezzar for vegetables. So it's what they're trying to say is that it was some ultimate test, okay, and that it had nothing to do with the food itself, the quality or anything. That it was impeccable. It was the best. It wasn't any laws that were broken in regard to the food or any like standards or like the other one suggested. That it was the epitome of opulence and luxury, this food that Nebuchadnezzar was actually offering, but it symbolized his faithfulness and fidelity to the Most High, our Father. It says, all of us face forks in the road of our lives whereby we decide either to follow the Lord or go our own way. Whether we are in our Christian walk today is the result of choices of the past. The friends that we have selected, the choice of a life partner, moral decisions, and the vocation that we choose have all taken us to where we are right now today. Few ask the questions, what is God's will? What does God's word have to say about this? Everything is valid. Everyone has his or her own viewpoint. No wonder such false living and false doctrine pervade the Christian church in our day. Precious few have deep spiritual moorings, they say, today. Then it says evangelical Christians are swept away like a flood after the world system. Then this particular article ends, it's very short. It says, if we live contrary to the will of God, God cannot bless us and work in our hearts. Rather, we will steadily deteriorate in our spirituality if we do not deal with our sins. You were just listening to Teachable Moments with April podcast. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode.